Professor Andrijauskas, thank you very much for taking the time to speak to us and to come to the conference. Right in the beginning, I would like to ask you about your assessment of the situation in Europe and beyond of the democracy and human rights. What it is like to look at the world from the perspectives of your expertise, being a professor at the Vilnius University and doing research in several important, crucial, key areas that are related to the human rights and democracy, especially in the light of the protection of the rights of minorities and human rights in general.
Thanks a lot. It is indeed my pleasure to be here. Enjoyed it a lot. Indeed, I would say that the situation is very dire and complex at the moment that we're living in. Throughout this last 5 years or so, we are living through what is commonly described as polycrisis, so numerous different crises of different nature occurring at the same time. And it has obviously increased our common and individual sense of insecurity. We are way more willing to look for someone to blame for our predicament. We are way more willing to express intolerance to the people who live alongside. We are way less resistant to the attempts by hostile and unfriendly actors to use our fundamental weaknesses to further their respective agendas and their respective interests towards our societies and our states. And writ large, I would strongly argue that there is this underlying big, huge problem that we do not respect the truth anymore. This brings a numerous amount of problems, including those that are related with the fact that if one does not really respects the objective truth, one is way more willing to emphasize the things that are associated with identitarian and cultural conflicts. So this willingness to put the emphasis on one's identity instead of looking at the possibility for dialogue is something that I would consider to be very problematic.
Well, the Lithuanian democracy, the Lithuanian society has been struggling in the past, but since it's independent from the former Soviet Union, from one to another day, so to speak, the Lithuanian society serves as an example of democracy, of a good care for the human rights. And in that context, can you point out a couple of things that maybe our societies, European societies or the Balkan societies could learn from? What is it that you would share with our society that comes from Lithuania in the future?
In the early 1990s, when Lithuania made its first steps towards regaining of our independence after 50 years of occupation, one of the major debates was about how to approach the ethno-linguistic minorities in our country. Right, and a pretty substantial part of those minorities was composed of the people who became inhabitants of the country, who started to call this country home throughout the 50 years of the Soviet occupation. So obviously the entire situation got politicized to quite a large degree, but Lithuania, contrary to some of its key neighbors and friends, it decided to extend the so-called zero option to other ethno-linguistic communities, the so-called minority groups, which meant that every single person registered in the Republic of Lithuania in the 1990 could gain the citizenship of independent Republic of Lithuania automatically if he or she wanted. So this, in effect, meant that the vast majority of those people, they extended and they decided to use this right and become Lithuanian citizens, and therefore were embraced by the political community of the country, becoming citizens in the real sense of that word. And this was definitely a good thing, but it does not mean that we haven't experienced problems ever since, right? As in many other countries which were at that time not yet mature democracies, and particularly considering that just in our neighborhood we've got a couple of very hostile and resourceful authoritarian actors who wanted to use this and other questions to further their own agendas. We always had to approach this question in a very sensitive manner. And I believe that to a pretty large degree we succeeded in doing so. But later on, yet again with the rise of polycrisis, which in our case was also associated with the what we would call hybrid activities conducted by the neighboring autocratic countries, Russia and Belarus in particular, we also for the first time encountered the need to interact in a way larger manner with the people whom we knew much less about, including the migrants from culturally different countries, including the refugees fleeing the war in Ukraine, for example. And those numbers, they were indeed big. Lithuania is at the most diverse moment currently since the re-establishment of our independence in the early 1990s. And this is a source of some tensions. But at this time, I would believe that we managed to overcome the vast majority of those. But ultimately, what I wanted to say that no society and no country is living through ideal times. And in all societies, in all countries, there are some problems, there are some issues, and one has to solve them on a day-to-day basis. What needs to be kept in mind, though, is yet again that if one is to seriously think about the prosperous and peaceful future of one's country, one needs to emphasize social relationships and social trust. The thing that we still lack in the post-socialist countries, my and yours included, but still have to build this up bit by bit on a daily, constant basis.
I was part of the high-level forum against authoritarianism, future of democracy in Vilnius, Lithuania, by a kind invitation of the Minister of Foreign Affairs and the Embassy of Lithuania in North Macedonia. And there was a common statement almost shared amongst the participants in this forum, that democracy is under threat. Nevertheless, the title of the conference, of the forum, and the speeches, the presentations of the people from all around the world that took part of the forum was looking towards the future, and actually it was called Future of Democracy. Unlike this title of that forum, but in the same context and direction, we decided even longer ago to call this conference organized by Civil and Media Dialogue from Germany, Defending Democracy and Human Rights and so forth. So I believe that looking into the future is not possible at this moment, especially after what you said and what you described in the examples of Lithuania, but also pointing out critical points there, is not possible without defending democracy, finding ways of defending democracy and human rights. So that's where my question lays. It's probably very difficult to live in a society with a neighbor such as Belarus, which is a co-perpetrator of the brutal aggression against Ukraine, and Russia and its territorial and a piece of territory called Kaliningrad, which is highly militarized as far as we know. So is it difficult, and how difficult it is, and what do you do in these circumstances, geopolitical, military, and security situation at that level, to preserve democracy and human rights in Lithuania? Do you take measures? Do you take concrete steps, and what they are in short terms, in brief, so that we can learn, because we are not very far from that situation either.
Very interesting observations that you've got from Vilnius, and indeed mine were very much the same. I was actually surprised by the fact that we were so much on the defensive, actually, when it comes to the agenda. And I do certainly recognize that this is the key part of your job. But the impression that I've got is that, when it comes to the democratic and authoritarian countries, the way I see the current situation is that we are in a race. We are in a race. Liberal democracies, those countries that value human rights, that value human dignity, which is an indistinguishable concept in this regard, and the countries that are perpetrators of those that do not have enough respect. Well, I'm not talking even about the rest. That's a given, but enough respect towards their own citizens, towards their own people, and I would argue that we're in a race. And whenever we are on the defensive, the impression that I also got from the Vilnius Forum, the future of democracy, was a certain sense of passivity, even, and it is interesting considering the fact that we as democracies currently we've got quite a lot of problems. That's very much evident. Whatever country we would point on, whether that's in Europe, whether that's in across the Atlantic, or in East Asia, we just had the South Korean precedent, which was also a shock, I believe, to all of us. We consider South Korea to be, and it is a consolidated liberal democracy, but yet again, similar things, they can and do occur, even apparently. Yeah, but at the same time, what we need to remember is that the authoritarian actors, they're also in that race. And there are lots of problems there as well. Lots of problems, an extreme amount of problems there, which was very much showcased yet again by the Russian inability to affect the situation in Syria, for example. Russia showcases and portrays itself as a tremendously relevant military power, and we saw that it was swept away as a house of cards in Syria, which was their pride spot in their Middle Eastern policies. So we are in the race, which means that yes, totally, we have to defend our principles. This is key. Right? But at the same time, we have to work with the respective societies in those countries, I would strongly argue. And this is somewhat problematic because the authoritarian regimes, they have no reservations about attempting to affect us. Why shouldn't we have reservations about affecting their respective societies? Because this is something that we have and ought to do as human rights defenders. We cannot be human rights defenders in our society only and neglect human rights abuses in Russia, for that matter, in China, or in many other countries. That would be insincere, that would be ungrateful as well. And this is something that I would strongly believe that we have to do if we want to affect the situation, not only defensively, so to speak. It's not about being offensive. It's about being consistent with one's principles. And so this would be my willingness to express this general thought that the game is not lost, that the authoritarian systems, they've got a huge amount of problems of their own, but at this time they were indeed good enough and effective enough at exposing their weaknesses. So what we need to do in these circumstances is to double down on our commitment to the things that made us not only economically, not only politically, but morally strong and consistent. And human rights is the key single principle which underlies that, because ultimately this is the basis of our normative agenda, not only within the globe, but also in our constant day-to-day dialogue with our own societies and the respective members of it.
Thank you. That's a very important point that you made. Consistency, being true to yourself, to oneself, and to double down on respecting the human rights. Well, Professor, I would like to then ask you, what is your assessment of the future? What are the perspectives of Europe and beyond democracy, given everything that is going on and that is also expected to go on, with all this rise of far-right nationalist political parties in the most developed democracies. So what is your assessment? What do you think?
I'm definitely concerned about the developments in this regard, but at the same time, I remain optimistic. I do understand that a push has to be made in order to produce success stories which are desperately needed in our dire times. That there is a very clear-cut lack of leadership, including moral leadership, among Western liberal democracies. I would consider the election of Donald Trump to be a manifestation of this trend. I believe that the problem of Donald Trump, as far as I'm concerned, is precisely that he questions the objective truth, and that should be the underlying foundation of how we as social beings interact with one another. Not everything is as socially constructed. Human rights, they are not as socially constructed. Human rights, they're the foundational principle of respectful interaction among and between the people. So it is not something that we created because it was imposed on us, right? It was something that we created because it's the best possible manifestation of how the people should interact with one another peacefully without causing conflicts, right? And in this particular regard, I am optimistic, but since we are in this competition, and in many ways it is a battle-like competition, it also means that we have to constantly nurture and reassure ourselves about our moral principles, but at the same time, I totally agree that we have to increase our defensive capabilities in terms of counteracting the actions that are attempting to expose us to the vilest impulses that all of us have as human beings. All of us are subject to that, and the fight against those impulses, which are about identitarian politics, which are about the willingness to join the side of the stronger, the willingness to join the side of the one who has more money, right? These are impulses which are natural for human beings, but again, this is something that we have to resist if we are serious about establishing a better future for us and our children.
I had several meetings with different people in Lithuania, and at a couple of occasions I shared my feeling about the country. I said that Lithuania might be a small country by size, but it's a great nation. And it's a great example that one should follow. And looking at the recent history, Lithuania was warning bigger countries in the Western Hemisphere. It was warning European countries, big European Union players, of the imminent threat that was posed by the Kremlin, but actually nobody listened. One of the most illustrative examples of this kind of warnings was 2008 in Bucharest NATO summit, when the Western powers didn't really listen to these kind of advices and warnings. Well, I sincerely hope that now everyone in the progressive liberal democratic world will have a little bit more open senses for recommendations and for warnings that are coming also from, so to speak, smaller countries. Because in my view, at least personally, there are no small or big countries. There are only important ideas. There are big ideas, and there are ideas that we have to defend from. I hope that this will be the case in the future, because without that, examples, positive examples and warnings and the wisdom that comes from countries like yours, I believe that we stand a chance. Otherwise, not really. I don't know.
Definitely, and actually, it reminds me of the question that you posed earlier: what to do if you are in such a unpredictable, intense environment, and the same being that Lithuania finds itself. Well, this is something that can bring social and political solidarity for the political community, and this is something that should be done. And I believe that one of the main lessons behind Russia's descent towards hardcore authoritarianism, and particularly its full-scale genocidal invasion of Ukraine is precisely about that. We have to very carefully look at Russia and try to find out what is it that triggers them the most. And you would find human rights at the center of that. In ethno-linguistic terms, in the terms of the gender rights, LGBT plus, Q plus communities, all of that, Russia is fundamentally against that. So this is a reason that I would strongly hope would give our region, the so-called New Europe. I don't like that name in particular, but this is something that would group us together from the Baltics, from the 3 Baltic states to the Western Balkans and everything in between, that it would mobilize us towards the understanding that those are the principles that are important enough for the other country to come and kill in order to destroy those principles. So they have very big and consequential power, something that we often miss or tend to, if we're luckier, or tend to hold as a given, right? But it can be taken from you, right? Very easily by a hostile and force that is committed enough, the way the Russian regime is. And this should bring us some food for thought. That those principles are indeed of utmost importance, and that it is that particular thing that makes us so much different from the other side that wants to destroy us.